People think the most expensive mistake in this story was the millions of gallons of water that disappeared, but they are wrong. The most expensive mistake was believing nobody would ever question who had the authority to open the gates. That was the thought running through my mind as I stood on the rocky shoreline of my reservoir, watching engineers lower measuring equipment into water that should have been nearly 20 feet higher. Behind them, county inspectors quietly photographed the exposed banks while survey crews compared current elevations against historical records. Across the access road stood Victoria Langford wearing a brightly colored designer blazer, oversized jewelry reflecting the morning sun, and the same calm confidence that suggested she still believed everything unfolding around her would somehow confirm she had been right all along. She folded her arms and watched the inspection without saying a word. 3 weeks earlier, neither of us imagined we would be standing there. My name is Grant Holloway, and until recently I believed one of the greatest advantages of owning a private reservoir was that almost nobody remembered it existed. Hidden in the foothills outside western Montana, surrounded by pine forests and open ranch land, the reservoir had been built decades earlier as part of a privately funded water management project serving my family's agricultural property. Over time, it became much more than a storage basin. It supported irrigation, protected downstream pastures during dry summers, supplied emergency reserves during wildfire season, and created a healthy habitat for fish and wildlife that had gradually transformed the entire valley. Independent appraisals valued the reservoir and its supporting infrastructure at roughly $8 million, not because the water itself carried that price, but because of the engineering, permits, land improvements, and long-term value connected to the system. I had spent years maintaining every component exactly the way my father taught me. Pumps were inspected on schedule. Spillways were monitored after every major storm. Professional engineers reviewed the structure annually, and every maintenance report found its place inside neatly organized binders stored in my office. My father always believed that people rarely appreciated careful preparation until something unexpected happened. I understood exactly what he meant the afternoon I returned from a 12-day consulting trip in Colorado. The drive home felt completely ordinary until I rounded the final bend overlooking the reservoir. Instead of seeing the familiar blue surface stretching across the valley, I immediately noticed a wide ring of exposed shoreline circling nearly the entire basin. At first, I assumed an unusually dry season had lowered the water level more than expected, but that explanation disappeared the moment I parked my truck and checked the fixed elevation markers installed along the concrete intake tower. The water had dropped far beyond anything natural conditions could explain in less than 2 weeks. My phone was already in my hand as I walked toward the control building. Every gauge confirmed the same disturbing reality. Large volumes of water had been released while I was away. I checked the electronic monitoring system, expecting to find an equipment malfunction. Instead, the operational log showed repeated gate activity occurring over several consecutive days. Someone had intentionally operated the system. I called the engineering contractor responsible for annual inspections. They confirmed no maintenance work had been scheduled. I contacted the county water office. They reported issuing no emergency directives involving my reservoir. The answers only deepened the mystery. Before I could continue making calls, I noticed fresh vehicle tracks leading toward the secondary service road connecting my property to the neighboring residential development. Curious now, I followed the gravel road until I reached a recently installed temporary pumping station positioned near a shared drainage corridor. Several portable pumps stood quietly beside neatly arranged hoses extending toward landscaped retention ponds serving the nearby subdivision. Workers were packing equipment into trailers as though the job had just been completed. One man politely explained that the operation had been authorized through the Homeowners Association to improve neighborhood water levels after an unusually dry period. I thanked him for the information and asked who had approved using water from my reservoir. He hesitated, glanced toward the clubhouse visible across the hillside, and finally answered with complete certainty. The association president handled everything. Less than 15 minutes later, I parked outside the clubhouse entrance, where a luxury sport utility vehicle already occupied the front space. The driver's door opened, and Victoria Langford stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses, colorful designer clothing, and enough confidence to suggest she had absolutely no doubt she had acted within her authority. She smiled politely, adjusted the sleeve of her bright blazer, and greeted me as though we were about to discuss landscaping instead of millions of gallons of missing water. "Mr. Holloway," she said warmly, "I was hoping we would have the opportunity to meet. I believe you will understand why the community appreciated the decision once I explain it." Victoria continued smiling as though we were discussing the schedule for a neighborhood picnic instead of a reservoir that had dropped to a level I had never seen before. She gestured toward the clubhouse windows overlooking the subdivision and invited me inside for what she called a brief explanation. I followed without raising my voice because I had learned long ago that the first conversation after discovering a serious problem should be spent gathering information instead of making accusations. The clubhouse conference room overlooked several decorative ponds that reflected the afternoon sunlight. They looked unusually full for the middle of a dry season, and I immediately understood where at least part of my missing water had gone. Victoria sat at the head of the polished table, adjusted the sleeve of her brightly colored designer blazer, and opened a thick binder filled with community documents. Several board members quietly took seats along the opposite side of the table, greeting me politely before arranging their own folders. Victoria folded her hands together with complete confidence. "Our landscaping committee has spent months trying to protect community green spaces during one of the driest summers we have experienced," she explained. The retention ponds had fallen to critically low levels, and residents were becoming increasingly concerned about property values, irrigation, and wildlife. I listened without interrupting. She continued by describing emergency meetings, contractor recommendations, and discussions about available water sources throughout the surrounding valley. According to her explanation, someone had identified my reservoir as the largest nearby supply capable of stabilizing the neighborhood ponds. She spoke as though the conclusion had been perfectly logical. When she finished, I asked a single question: "Who gave permission to release water from my reservoir?" She looked genuinely surprised by the wording. "The association approved the project," she answered. "Our legal committee determined that because your reservoir directly affects the watershed serving the surrounding area, temporary water management fell within our authority during exceptional conditions." I asked whether anyone had contacted me before opening the control gates. Victoria calmly admitted they had not. She explained that neighbors believed I traveled frequently and that delaying the project could have harmed the appearance of the community. One of the board members added that contractors assured them the water level would recover naturally during the next rainy season. I thanked everyone for explaining their understanding of the situation before opening the maintenance folder I had brought from my truck. Inside were engineering drawings, operating permits, maintenance logs, inspection reports, and ownership documents that had been updated regularly for years. I slid the first survey across the table. It clearly identified the reservoir, intake structures, control gates, and surrounding land as privately owned infrastructure. The next document outlined the annual inspection requirements completed by licensed engineers. Another showed state permits governing operation of the water control system. Victoria glanced through each page but remained composed. "Those documents establish ownership," she said. "They do not necessarily limit the association's ability to coordinate water resources affecting the neighborhood." Her confidence never changed. Instead of arguing, I asked if she could show me the document granting the association that authority. She immediately turned to another section of her binder containing neighborhood bylaws, architectural standards, landscaping regulations, and maintenance policies. Together we reviewed several pages discussing common areas, ponds owned by the association, irrigation schedules, and environmental guidelines. Every policy referred to association property or shared community facilities. None specifically mentioned my reservoir. Victoria paused for the first time that afternoon. She flipped through additional pages before calling the community manager, who arrived carrying another storage box filled with archived meeting minutes. They searched carefully while I waited. The room remained quiet except for the sound of paper turning. Nearly 20 minutes later, the community manager admitted she could not immediately locate any recorded agreement involving my property. Victoria finally looked up from the documents and explained that previous boards had always operated under the understanding that the reservoir formed part of the neighborhood's long-term water planning. She emphasized that every decision had been made with the community's interests in mind. I believed she genuinely thought she was telling the truth. That realization made the situation more complicated, not less. Good intentions could not replace legal authority, but neither did they automatically mean someone had acted dishonestly. As the meeting ended, I thanked everyone for their time and told Victoria I intended to verify every historical record before reaching conclusions. She smiled politely and said she welcomed any review because she remained certain the association had acted appropriately. Walking back toward my truck, I looked once more at the unusually full decorative ponds beside the clubhouse before turning toward the exposed shoreline surrounding my reservoir. Something about the entire sequence still felt incomplete. Someone, somewhere in the past, had convinced successive HOA boards that they possessed authority extending far beyond the neighborhood itself, and I intended to discover exactly how that belief had survived for so many years. The following morning I met with a water resources engineer named Rebecca Lawson, someone who had inspected private reservoirs across Montana for more than 20 years. Rather than beginning with legal questions, she wanted to understand exactly what had happened to the structure itself. We spent nearly 4 hours walking the shoreline, inspecting the spillway, reviewing the electronic control logs, and comparing current water elevations against maintenance records from previous years. Every observation was carefully photographed and documented before anyone discussed responsibility. Rebecca eventually stood beside the concrete control structure, studying the operating log displayed on a rugged tablet connected to the monitoring system. These gate movements were not caused by weather, she said calmly. Someone intentionally operated the release controls several times over multiple days. She pointed to the timestamps showing each adjustment had been performed gradually instead of all at once. Whoever managed the releases had clearly intended to lower the reservoir in a controlled manner rather than responding to an emergency. That distinction mattered because emergency operations followed completely different reporting procedures. We continued examining the downstream channel until we reached the temporary pumping station I had discovered the previous afternoon. Although most of the portable equipment had already been removed, fresh tire tracks, hose connections, and temporary mounting brackets remained visible. Rebecca measured several connection points before shaking her head slightly. This installation was planned, she said. It was not something assembled overnight. Her observation matched what I had begun to suspect. Considerable time, equipment, and coordination had been required before the first gallon of water ever left my reservoir. Later that afternoon, I contacted the engineering company responsible for annual structural inspections. They confirmed once again that they had received no request to evaluate temporary water transfers or increased releases before the operation began. I then spoke with the regional office responsible for water administration. The official reviewing my inquiry searched permit records for several minutes before confirming that no emergency authorization involving my reservoir had been issued during the period I was away. He encouraged me to gather every technical document before drawing conclusions because water management questions often involved multiple agencies and historical agreements. That advice reinforced the approach I had already chosen. Facts first, assumptions later. Over the next several days, Rebecca and I assembled a complete technical timeline, beginning with the first recorded gate movement and ending with my return home. Electronic monitoring data showed reservoir elevations changing exactly as expected when controlled releases occurred. Rainfall records demonstrated that natural conditions could not explain the decline. Satellite imagery obtained through publicly available historical mapping services even showed the decorative ponds inside the neighboring subdivision gradually expanding during the same period. None of those observations independently established legal responsibility, but together they created a consistent sequence of events that deserved further examination. Curious about the neighborhood's history, I visited the county planning office to review archived development records connected to the subdivision. Planning technician Michael Reeves greeted me politely before helping locate several large map drawers containing original project files. We spread decades-old engineering drawings across a conference table, tracing utility corridors, drainage systems, and retention ponds from one revision to the next. One detail immediately caught Rebecca's attention. Every approved drainage plan identified the subdivision ponds as self-contained stormwater facilities designed to function independently from my private reservoir. There was no approved connection requiring supplemental water from my property. Michael searched additional archive boxes containing later amendments and maintenance updates. None modified that original design. As far as these planning files show, he explained, the subdivision was expected to manage its own water features. That statement raised an entirely new question. If the approved engineering plans never depended on my reservoir, when had people begun believing the opposite? Before leaving, Michael located one final folder containing early correspondence between the original developer and county reviewers. Most of the letters discussed landscaping schedules, drainage calculations, and construction timelines. Near the bottom of one page, however, a brief handwritten note referenced a proposal to explore future cooperation with neighboring landowners regarding optional water management. The proposal had never been marked approved, adopted, or incorporated into the final engineering package. Rebecca quietly placed the document beside the approved plans. Sometimes, she said, ideas discussed during development become local stories, and local stories eventually become accepted as fact. Driving home that evening, I kept thinking about that single sentence. Victoria had never behaved like someone trying to conceal evidence. Instead, she seemed completely convinced she was protecting the community by following an understanding that may have been repeated for years without anyone verifying where it actually came from. The technical evidence continued pointing in one direction, while the community's confidence pointed in another, and somewhere between those two realities lay the answer that would determine everything that happened next. Rebecca's observation stayed with me throughout the weekend because it explained something that had never quite fit the situation. If the subdivision had been engineered to operate independently, then the decision to use water from my reservoir had almost certainly originated somewhere outside the approved design documents. Instead of speculating, I hired a land use attorney named Daniel Foster, whose practice focused on property rights and water management throughout the western states. We spent an entire afternoon organizing every piece of information collected so far into a single timeline. The operating logs documented when the release gates had been opened. The engineering inspection confirmed the releases were intentional. County planning files showed no approved connection between the reservoir and the subdivision ponds. Historical permits identified the reservoir as privately owned infrastructure maintained under my responsibility. Daniel studied the documents quietly before looking up. The important question is no longer whether water was released, he said. The important question is what authority everyone believed they were relying on when they made that decision. That distinction mattered because misunderstandings and documented authority were not the same thing. Rather than immediately beginning formal legal action, Daniel suggested sending a professional request asking the Homeowners Association to provide every agreement, easement, permit, engineering report, or recorded document that supported its understanding of the reservoir. The request was respectful, specific, and limited entirely to factual records. A few days later, Victoria agreed to another meeting inside the clubhouse conference room. She greeted us with the same polished confidence as before, wearing another brightly colored designer blazer accented by oversized jewelry that reflected the afternoon light whenever she turned toward the windows. Several board members joined her along with the association's legal counsel and community manager. Boxes of archived files filled one side of the room. Victoria explained that the association wanted complete transparency and had gathered every historical record available to the current board. For nearly 3 hours, we carefully reviewed maintenance contracts, landscaping agreements, meeting minutes, engineering invoices, budget reports, and correspondence dating back many years. The files documented how the neighborhood managed its ponds, irrigation systems, and common areas with impressive detail. Yet every time the discussion returned to my reservoir, the references became indirect. Older meeting minutes mentioned cooperation with neighboring water resources. Planning summaries referred to long-standing community understanding. Several reports assumed supplemental water could be available if necessary. None identified a recorded agreement granting the association authority to operate my reservoir or direct releases from it. Daniel asked whether earlier boards had ever received copies of such an agreement. Victoria answered honestly that she had never personally seen one. She explained that when she joined the board years earlier, every experienced member spoke about the reservoir as though its availability had always been part of the neighborhood's planning. No one questioned that assumption because it had been repeated consistently for so long. I believed her. She sounded less like someone defending a deliberate decision and more like someone discovering gaps in a story she had accepted without hesitation. Before the meeting ended, Daniel suggested that both sides continue exchanging historical records before drawing final conclusions. Victoria agreed immediately, saying she wanted the complete history understood just as much as we did. As we walked outside, I noticed residents enjoying the walking paths surrounding the now full decorative ponds. Families were feeding ducks, children rode bicycles along quiet streets, and neighbors chatted beneath rows of mature trees. Nothing about the scene suggested conflict. Yet beneath that peaceful afternoon rested decades of assumptions that had never been fully examined. Driving away from the clubhouse, I realized the next discovery would probably not come from another conversation. It would come from whatever piece of history had convinced an entire community that permission existed, even though nobody had yet been able to place that permission on the conference table. 3 days after our second meeting, Daniel called before sunrise and asked if I could meet him at the county archives instead of his office. His voice carried the quiet excitement of someone who had found something important but wanted to verify every detail before drawing conclusions. When I arrived, several large document boxes were already waiting on a long wooden table beside rolls of aging engineering maps that had not been opened in years. An archivist explained that the files had recently been transferred from an off-site storage facility during a records preservation project, and many had never been digitized. We spent the next several hours working through correspondence from the original subdivision developer, engineering consultants, county reviewers, and environmental specialists. Most of the material confirmed what we already understood about the neighborhood's early planning process. Then one folder changed everything. Inside was a sequence of letters exchanged nearly 20 years earlier between the original developer and the owner of my family's ranch. The developer had requested permission to purchase supplemental water during unusually dry years after construction was complete. The proposal outlined possible pricing, operating procedures, engineering safeguards, and maintenance responsibilities. It looked remarkably detailed until we reached the final page. Instead of a signed agreement, the file contained a letter politely declining the proposal. My father had explained that the reservoir existed primarily to protect agricultural operations and environmental stability on our property, making long-term water transfers impractical. The county reviewer acknowledged receiving that decision and noted that the subdivision should continue operating under its independent water management plan. Daniel placed the letters beside the approved engineering drawings Rebecca had previously located. The pieces fit together perfectly. The proposal had been discussed. It had been documented. It had also been declined before construction was completed. Somehow, over the following years, the existence of those early discussions appeared to survive in local memory, while the final decision quietly disappeared from everyday conversation. Curious whether anyone else remembered those negotiations, I contacted Harold Benson, a retired civil engineer whose name appeared repeatedly throughout the early project files. Harold welcomed us into his home with several storage boxes filled with personal notebooks from his consulting career. He smiled when Daniel mentioned the reservoir, because he remembered the project immediately. According to Harold, everyone initially hoped the neighboring properties might eventually cooperate on water management. But once my father declined the proposal, the subdivision was redesigned to function without relying on the reservoir. Harold even showed us field sketches illustrating revised drainage calculations after the optional water supply was removed from the planning assumptions. The neighborhood was never supposed to depend on that reservoir, he said. The redesign solved the problem before construction moved forward. Hearing those words from someone directly involved in the engineering work removed the last major uncertainty from the technical history. Later that afternoon, Daniel organized every verified document into a chronological presentation beginning with the original proposal, continuing through my father's written refusal, and ending with the revised engineering plans approved by the county. Every important step was now supported by independent records from multiple sources rather than assumptions repeated over time. Before leaving the office, Daniel looked at the growing stack of certified copies and smiled slightly. What we have now is not simply a collection of documents, he said. It is a complete historical timeline showing how an idea that was never adopted gradually became accepted as though it had always been official. Driving home that evening, I passed the subdivision once again. Residents watered flower beds, walked their dogs, and enjoyed another quiet summer evening beside ponds that reflected the setting sun. Watching them, I felt no anger toward the families who lived there. Most had trusted professionals, developers, and previous community leaders long before Victoria ever joined the board. The real challenge ahead would not be proving what happened. The records now spoke clearly for themselves. The challenge would be helping everyone understand how a forgotten decision made decades earlier had quietly shaped an entire community's understanding of the reservoir until almost nobody remembered where the story had actually begun. By the beginning of the following week, Daniel believed we had reached the point where gathering more historical material would add very little compared to organizing what we already knew into a complete factual record. Rebecca prepared a detailed engineering summary describing the reservoir's design, operating procedures, inspection history, and the measured change in water elevation during the period I had been away. Harold provided a signed statement confirming the original subdivision redesign after the proposed water-sharing arrangement had been declined. County Archive staff certified copies of the planning correspondence, while the Water Administration Office confirmed that no emergency authorization involving my reservoir had been issued during the relevant dates. Every document came from a different source, yet every one supported the same sequence of events. Daniel carefully assembled the material into a formal package before requesting one final meeting with the association and its legal counsel. He explained that professional discussions often resolved misunderstandings more efficiently than immediately asking a court to evaluate competing interpretations. A few days later, we returned to the clubhouse conference room, where Victoria Langford greeted everyone with the same polished professionalism she had maintained throughout every previous meeting. Her brightly colored designer blazer and oversized jewelry remained impossible to overlook, yet her expression carried noticeably more curiosity than certainty. Alongside her sat the association attorney, several board members, and the community manager, each with notebooks open and historical files arranged neatly across the conference table. Daniel began by placing a chronological timeline in front of every participant. Rather than presenting conclusions first, he walked through each event exactly as supported by the documents. The original developer proposed purchasing supplemental water. My father declined the proposal in writing. County reviewers acknowledged the decision. Engineers revised the subdivision design so it would function independently. Final planning approvals reflected that redesign. Rebecca then explained the technical operation of the reservoir, emphasizing that controlled releases required deliberate gate movements and were never intended to support neighborhood retention ponds under the approved engineering plans. Harold's signed statement confirmed the redesign from the perspective of someone directly involved with the original project. Throughout the presentation, Victoria remained unusually quiet. She occasionally compared the certified copies with older association meeting minutes, pausing whenever familiar assumptions no longer aligned with the documented history. After nearly 2 hours, the association attorney leaned back in his chair and slowly closed the final binder. He acknowledged that his independent review had uncovered no recorded agreement granting the association authority to direct releases from my reservoir. He also explained that many current board members appeared to have inherited an interpretation that had gradually separated from the original planning documents over time. Victoria finally spoke, her voice noticeably calmer than during our first meeting. She admitted that every board orientation she had attended described the reservoir as a long-understood resource connected to the community, and because no one questioned that belief, she never thought to search for the original correspondence herself. Looking around the room, she quietly said that assumptions repeated often enough could begin to sound exactly like documented fact. No one argued with her. Daniel responded by emphasizing that our goal had never been to embarrass the association or create unnecessary conflict. The objective was simply to establish an accurate historical record and determine the appropriate legal responsibilities based upon verified evidence rather than inherited understanding. Before the meeting concluded, both legal teams agreed that the remaining questions would likely require judicial guidance because the matter involved property rights, engineering issues, and potential financial consequences extending beyond what either side could resolve privately. Even so, the tone inside the room had changed completely. The discussion was no longer centered on whether my reservoir belonged to me or whether the releases had occurred. Those questions had effectively been answered through independent documentation. The remaining issue concerned the legal consequences of decisions made while relying upon an incorrect historical assumption. As I walked outside, several residents approached politely, asking whether the meeting had gone well. I simply told them that everyone was working toward understanding the complete history before reaching final decisions. They thanked me for the answer and continued their evening walks around the neighborhood ponds. Watching them, I realized once again that most families had never participated in the decisions that created the misunderstanding. They had simply trusted the information passed from one generation of community leadership to the next. The facts were now finally aligned, and the next stage would focus not on discovering what happened, but on determining how the law would fairly address the consequences of those documented events. Several weeks passed before the court scheduled the primary hearing, giving both sides ample opportunity to organize expert reports, certified records, and historical evidence into a complete presentation. By that point, the case had quietly attracted attention among engineers, surveyors, and property professionals throughout the region because it combined water management, historical planning, and private property rights in a way few people had encountered before. On the morning of the hearing, Daniel and I arrived carrying the same collection of binders that had steadily grown as every verified document found its proper place. Across the courtroom, Victoria Langford sat beside the association attorney wearing another brightly colored designer blazer accented by oversized jewelry that reflected the courtroom lights whenever she adjusted her notes. Her posture remained confident, yet the certainty that had defined our earliest conversations had softened into careful attentiveness. The hearing began with the court reviewing the historical timeline rather than opinions or speculation. Certified ownership records established the reservoir's uninterrupted private ownership. County planning officials explained the subdivision approval process and described how the final engineering plans had been revised after the proposed supplemental water arrangement was declined. Rebecca Lawson testified about the reservoir's operating system, explaining how the electronic logs demonstrated a series of deliberate gate adjustments over multiple days instead of weather-related changes or equipment failures. She also confirmed that the observed decline in water level closely matched the documented release activity and that no engineering inspection had recommended those releases before they occurred. Harold Benson then described the redesign meetings from decades earlier, recalling how the neighborhood's drainage system had ultimately been engineered to function independently after my father declined the proposal for optional water purchases. His testimony aligned precisely with the archived correspondence recovered from county storage, reinforcing that the original planning assumptions had been formally revised before construction moved forward. When it became the association's turn to present its position, the attorney acknowledged that extensive searches of historical records had not located any recorded agreement authorizing the association to operate or direct releases from my reservoir. Instead, he explained that successive boards appeared to have relied upon long-standing institutional understanding passed from one leadership group to the next. Several archived meeting minutes referenced community beliefs regarding the reservoir, but none established legal authority equivalent to a recorded easement, contract, or operating agreement. Victoria then addressed the court directly. She explained that she had accepted those long-standing assumptions in good faith because every experienced board member she had worked alongside described them as established fact. She emphasized that the association believed it was acting for the benefit of the neighborhood and never intended to disregard anyone's lawful property rights. Listening to her, I realized once again that the dispute had never truly centered on personalities. It centered on the difference between inherited assumptions and verifiable documentation. During the afternoon session, the court carefully compared the engineering plans, historical correspondence, operating permits, electronic logs, and certified ownership records side by side. Every independent source pointed toward the same conclusion. The proposal to obtain supplemental water had existed. It had been declined. The subdivision had then been redesigned without relying upon my reservoir. Years later, however, the memory of the original proposal had gradually survived while the written decision rejecting it faded from everyday understanding. Before concluding the hearing, the judge summarized the evidence in measured terms. noting that the documentary record appeared remarkably consistent across multiple independent sources collected from different agencies in different decades. Rather than issuing an immediate decision from the bench, the court announced that a written ruling would follow after reviewing the remaining legal questions involving responsibility, documented losses, and the appropriate civil remedies supported by the evidence. As everyone gathered their papers, Victoria approached Daniel and me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She quietly admitted that seeing every historical document arranged in chronological order had completely changed her understanding of the community's history. She said she wished those records had been reviewed years earlier because many decisions might have unfolded differently. I thanked her for saying so, and we shook hands before walking in opposite directions. Leaving the courthouse that afternoon, I felt neither triumph nor relief. Instead, I felt confidence that whatever decision came next would be based upon facts that had finally been assembled into one complete story, allowing the truth preserved in decades of records to speak more clearly than assumptions ever could. Nearly 5 weeks after the hearing, Daniel called just after sunrise and asked me to meet him at the courthouse because the written decision had finally been released. Unlike the uncertainty that had surrounded every previous stage of the case, this morning felt unusually quiet. There were no television cameras waiting outside, no large crowds gathering on the courthouse steps, and no dramatic speculation about what might happen next. Most people simply wanted clarity after months of carefully reviewing documents that stretched back more than 2 decades. Inside the courtroom, both legal teams received certified copies of the ruling before anyone spoke. Daniel read through every page slowly, occasionally marking sections with a pencil before looking up with a calm smile. The court concluded that the documentary evidence consistently established my ownership of the reservoir and confirmed that no recorded agreement, easement, permit, or other legal instrument had ever granted the Homeowners Association authority to direct releases from the system. The ruling also recognized that the association's decisions had been based upon a mistaken understanding that developed over many years rather than on verified legal authority. At the same time, the court explained that good faith reliance did not eliminate responsibility for the documented consequences of those decisions. Rebecca's engineering reports, certified inspection records, operational data, historical planning documents, and expert evaluations had all been reviewed together. Independent specialists calculated the costs associated with restoring reservoir operations, repairing environmental impacts, replacing lost water resources where appropriate, conducting additional engineering inspections, monitoring long-term stability, and addressing the measurable financial consequences supported by evidence. After evaluating those reports, the court entered a civil damages award totaling $12 million. The figure reflected the documented losses accepted by the court after reviewing the expert testimony rather than a penalty designed to punish anyone personally. Daniel quietly reminded me that large numbers often attracted attention, but the written explanation behind them mattered far more than the headline itself. Across the courtroom, Victoria Langford sat silently beside the association attorney. Her brightly colored designer blazer and oversized jewelry remained as noticeable as ever, yet her expression reflected careful reflection rather than disbelief. When the proceedings concluded, the judge emphasized that the ruling should not be interpreted as criticism of every homeowner living in the subdivision. The evidence consistently showed that most residents had purchased their homes and supported their community in good faith, relying upon information they reasonably believed to be accurate. Responsibility rested with the documented decisions and the legal obligations attached to those decisions, not with ordinary families who had never participated in the historical misunderstanding. Outside the courthouse, several residents approached Victoria with thoughtful questions instead of frustration. She answered each one patiently, explaining that the association would comply with the court's orders and cooperate fully during the implementation process. Later that afternoon, she requested a private conversation with Daniel and me. We met at a small conference room inside the courthouse where she thanked everyone involved for approaching the dispute professionally instead of turning it into unnecessary public conflict. She admitted that reviewing the complete historical record had changed her understanding of the community's past and acknowledged that future boards would need stronger procedures for verifying important assumptions before acting upon them. Daniel agreed. pointing out that one of the most valuable outcomes of the case extended beyond the reservoir itself. Accurate records, transparent decision-making, and independent verification would help prevent similar misunderstandings for future community leaders. During the following weeks, engineers began supervising restoration work while financial arrangements ordered by the court moved through the appropriate legal process. Water levels gradually returned to planned operating ranges under professional monitoring. Environmental specialists documented improving conditions along the shoreline, and county officials confirmed that every future operational decision involving the reservoir would follow the permits and ownership records that had existed all along. Driving past the subdivision one evening, I noticed families enjoying the walking paths surrounding the decorative ponds just as they had before the dispute began. Children laughed near the playground, neighbors greeted one another across freshly maintained lawns, and the mountains surrounding the valley looked exactly as they always had. The difference was invisible to anyone passing through, yet it mattered more than almost anything else. Every important decision affecting the reservoir would now begin with verified facts instead of inherited assumptions, and the history that had once been scattered across forgotten archive boxes had finally become the foundation for a clearer future. Several months have passed since the court issued its final ruling, and when I stand beside the reservoir today, it is almost impossible to recognize the uncertainty that once surrounded this place. The water has returned to its planned operating level under the supervision of licensed engineers. Native vegetation has begun reclaiming the shoreline that was temporarily exposed, and the wildlife that has always depended on the reservoir has gradually returned to familiar patterns. The annual inspection performed that autumn concluded that the structure remained sound, and the additional monitoring required by the restoration plan confirmed that the system continued operating exactly as it had been designed decades earlier. Looking across the valley, I often think about how close I came to believing that the missing water was the real story. It was not. The real story was how easily an assumption can survive long enough to become accepted as unquestionable truth. Over the following months, the Homeowners Association implemented several important governance changes. Future boards adopted stricter record verification procedures before approving projects involving neighboring properties. Historical documents were digitized and organized for easier access, and outside legal review became part of major decisions affecting land, water, or infrastructure. Those changes did not erase what had happened, but they significantly reduced the chances of the same misunderstanding affecting another generation of community leaders. Victoria Langford remained involved with the neighborhood during the transition, although her role gradually changed. The confidence that once came from relying on inherited assumptions was replaced by a noticeably more careful approach whenever important decisions were discussed. During one community meeting that I attended months later, she openly encouraged residents to verify original records instead of depending entirely upon tradition or memory. Hearing those words from the same person who had first insisted the association possessed unquestionable authority reminded me that difficult experiences sometimes produce meaningful growth. We spoke only briefly after that meeting, but our conversation was cordial and respectful. She thanked me for approaching every disagreement through documentation rather than anger, and I acknowledged that she had cooperated professionally once the historical evidence became clear. Neither of us could change the past, but both of us understood the importance of learning from it. As for me, I invested part of the recovered funds into long-term improvements that would benefit the property for decades to come. Modern monitoring equipment now provides additional safeguards for the reservoir. Updated environmental studies help guide seasonal water management, and expanded conservation areas protect the surrounding habitat while preserving the natural character my family valued for generations. The reservoir remains privately owned, but it also continues serving the broader landscape exactly as responsible stewardship should, supporting agriculture, wildlife, and emergency planning without compromising the legal boundaries that protect everyone's rights. Looking back, I never considered the case a personal victory over another individual. I considered it a victory for accurate records, patient investigation, and the simple idea that important decisions deserve to be built upon verified facts rather than assumptions repeated over time. Had I reacted emotionally instead of methodically, I might never have uncovered the forgotten correspondence, the revised engineering plans, or the complete historical timeline that ultimately explained everything. My father often told me that the truth rarely disappears forever. Sometimes it simply waits inside old file cabinets until someone cares enough to look. Standing beside the calm water today, I finally understand exactly what he meant. The reservoir remains one of the most valuable assets my family ever entrusted to me. But the greatest lesson it gave me had nothing to do with money. It taught me that patience, preparation, and careful documentation will almost always outlast confusion, and that treating people fairly while insisting on the truth creates better outcomes than letting frustration guide important decisions. Now, I would genuinely like to know what you think after hearing this story. If you found yourself in the same situation, would you have handled it differently, or would you have followed the same careful path of gathering evidence before taking action? Share your thoughts in the comments because I always enjoy reading different perspectives. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about property rights, difficult decisions, and ordinary people solving extraordinary problems through patience, evidence, and common sense, consider subscribing so you do not miss future stories. Thank you for spending your time with me, and I look forward to sharing another story with you soon.